We're here today to discuss the difference and the definitions of alienation and estrangement. I am Michelle Minette. I am a certified holistic life coach that runs a practice up in Hamilton, Ohio, that focuses on helping people heal from narcissistic abuse and toxic relationships. I'm here with Melanie Mize, attorney at law. Would you like to take a minute and introduce yourself?
I'm an attorney in Hamilton County, Ohio. I work mainly in family law matters, so custody, divorce, both in domestic relations and in juvenile courts. I also work as a mediator and as a guardian ad litem.
So you have seen a lot of narcissistic abuse or just plain toxic relationships or family dysfunction through the court system and through your work.
Absolutely. That is unfortunately a daily thing that I see at work. Different toxic relationships, high conflict, co-parenting, things like that.
Yeah, that must take a toll.
Absolutely.
Right.
On everybody.
Right. That vicarious trauma is real. Yeah. So we're going to talk about alienation versus estrangement. And this wasn't something that I was aware that was such a big deal with the differences in the use of the language until we had discussed it. So why don't we start with what is the definition of each?
So a lot of times this will come up in child custody and parenting time cases. A parent will accuse the other parent of alienating them. And what parental alienation refers to is when one parent engages in certain behaviors that undermine the relationship between the child and the other parent. And then it can result in the child actually rejecting that other parent, really for no legitimate reason. It just has to do with the behavior of the first parent, which is the alienating parent, their behavior toward the target parent or the alienated parent.
Okay.
So the crux of that definition is that the child is going to reject either totally or partially the relationship with the other parent for no legitimate reason. That is the big part, no legitimate reason.
So that's a really thorough definition. One of the things that I've noticed when I work with parents and families and kids is that it gets to the point where with parental alienation, the child not only rejects the things with the other parent, but they've also been kind of talked into believing that it's their idea. And I think that that's where the real serious emotional abuse occurs, is because at some point, usually in adulthood, they end up blaming themselves for alienating the other parent instead of realizing that they were a tool for the parent that was doing the alienation.
Yeah, there's no question that parental alienation is a form of abuse. It is a very serious form of abuse.
Right. Actually, and I would, I think I've even called it in the parenting classes that I would teach that it was probably, arguably, one of the worst forms of abuse, which is also what I say for gaslighting. And so I'm just realizing it now, isn't parental alienation a form of gaslighting?
Absolutely, yeah. You're convincing this child that what they see as their reality is not actually their reality. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought about it that way before, but absolutely.
That's why I love these things. These talks, these interviews, right? Like, I think best with my mouth open. I don't know about you.
So the interesting thing, one of the interesting things I see with the court is that they're not always very receptive to this idea of parental alienation. It's almost like they get very hung up on this term, and it's like cringeworthy to them. Mm-hmm. But when you're examining the statute, different factors the court has to go through when talking about custody or parenting time, there's always this element of, is one parent facilitating the relationship with the other parent? And if you're working against it, then you're doing the opposite of facilitating it. But for some reason, that alienation term is kind of difficult to swallow. But it definitely, if you really think about even the way the courts have defined this parent-child relationship, alienation is absolutely a very serious form of abuse. When we work with step-parent adoptions, sometimes I handle something like that, and we talk about whether or not someone's parental rights are going to be terminated as part of this step-parent adoption. There's case law where the court calls a step-parent adoption essentially the death penalty of parenting, because you're terminating that relationship. So in the case of alienation, where you have a child that's then refusing the relationship for no legitimate reason, that's kind of the death penalty of that relationship as well.
Wow. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. And that's interesting too, because we recently, recorded an interview with Mandy Friedman where we discussed terms that the court is averse to, right? And that we should avoid when we're in family court. And I'm wondering if parental alienation might be one of those other terms where it's better to provide evidence of interfering with attachment, because I think that's what you were going into, than calling it what it is, because calling it what it is has been abused to the point where people kind of get a bad taste in their mouth.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be one of those. It's interesting that you mentioned attachment. So I think that kind of goes into this the other piece of this, which is estrangement. So estrangement is when there is a rejection of that parent-child relationship, but there is a legitimate reason for it. So that could happen if the child is being abused by one parent and then they say, hey, I don't want to go over to that parent's house anymore. That's not alienation. That's where that abusive parent has actually estranged themselves from that child. And attachment can definitely figure into that. You arguably cannot have a complete alienation of relationship if you have a secure attachment with that parent-child relationship. So if you don't have that, or you've done something to undermine that attachment, then you might be looking more at estrangement.
But also, so estrangement, it's kind of like a natural consequence, maybe, of having a bad attachment to your child through a crappy parenting style, maybe.
Yeah. So there was at one point this, I don't know what it's called now, but it used to be called the 5-factor model when looking at alienation. And you have to have all 5 factors present for something to be alienation. And the second factor in that has to do with whether there is a prior positive relationship. And if you get to the real heart of what forms this positive relationship, you're looking at attachment.
Yeah, that's good. So, and I think, you've talked about like when they occur and how they're misused.
Sometimes you may have both occurring in the same case as well. You may have a parent who is engaging in alienating behaviors, and the targeted parent becomes so embroiled in that conflict and in what is happening to the child and to the relationship that they begin to estrange themselves. Maybe they start talking to the child about it a lot, and the kid says, hey, I just don't want to be involved. And so that parent starts estranging themselves.
Oh my gosh, that sounds so complicated. I'm just going to put this out there. It might make me unpopular with the courts, and at this point, I don't care. I think oftentimes the courts mess this up, and I think they often mess it up horribly. The number of cases I've seen in my office where they've messed it up horribly are just heartbreaking. But when you come across cases like this, that is a complicated situation for the court to try to figure out what exactly is going on. But also, when you were talking about it, I was thinking, it sounds like almost like the parent that is being targeted for alienation then engages in reactive abuse.
Yes.
Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, that is fair, absolutely.
Yeah. So then how do we, me as a mental wellness person and you as an attorney person working with these clients that are in these situations, I think it would be important to actually define or outline ways that we can help our clients refrain from or avoid falling into the trap of reactive abuse.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's pretty nuanced case by case. It involves, really examining the behavior of both parents in that situation and kind of filtering out who's doing which portion of it, and then helping your client not engage in the estranging or reactive type behavior, even though that is going to be really very tremendous of an undertaking for them at times, to not respond to what's going on with that other parent.
Right.
And in terms of the court, you really need some professionals on your side that are going to understand what these are, understand these two concepts, and be willing to really dive in with you and go over what's going on in your situation, and maybe have some very frank conversations with you and give you a strategy to employ so that when you're before the court, you're able to really show, here's what part of this is alienation and here's what's happening.
Right, and that gets difficult, right? I mean, I'm thinking about it, and most, I can't say all, but I would say there's a majority of people who end up in this situation where they're before the courts trying to protect themselves and their child against an abusive ex. They usually have a history of similar types of abuse. And so when all of that is reactivated, it's more and more and more increasingly difficult to dampen the intensity of the overwhelming emotions and find some way to regulate your behavior so that you'll look good in court, and that you look good on the texts and on the emails and over the phone and anything else that's recorded that can be brought in as evidence.
Yeah, you gotta have some solid professionals on your team that are going to help guide you through that.
Right.
One thing I think you got to keep in mind is that when you're in court, your judges and magistrates, they're attorneys. They're not necessarily, experts on child development and the attachment piece. They're not necessarily trauma informed, so they don't necessarily know what they're looking at here, and so you really need some people on your team that are going to help you present that to the court in a way that it can understand in a very clear fashion.
Right.
Because this person who is potentially alienating, who's engaging in these behaviors, if you think about it, they are convincing a child of something. Do you really think they're not going to try to convince the court of the same thing?
That's a good point. And if you're there, you've watched how persuasive they can be, even to people who like and love and have known you for years. And so if they're able to do that, you have to be prepared in court. So what I hear you saying is that people can't rely on the court to understand fully what these terms are, what the consequences of this type of behavior is, because it is abusive. Nor can we rely on the courts even to be trauma informed. And I've noticed that even at times there are GALs are not necessarily trauma informed.
Unfortunately, yes, that is true.
Well, we've got a lot of work there. So I think we've already answered the question about why it's important for people to know what the difference is. And I think we've even talked about a little bit about what parents can do if they're concerned about being alienated. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, not right now. It really is a really nuanced topic, and I think that we might need a little more time to delve into that one.
Okay, awesome. Well, it's a good thing that we're working together to plan some workshops so that we can address things in a more detailed way for people that need more information. And I really appreciate these discussions, and I'm so excited to be working with you and going over these topics so that we can bring them to people and help them navigate these sticky and at times nightmarish situations.
Yeah, Yeah, thank you for having this conversation with me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Melanie. I look forward to having more discussions with you and to planning and letting everybody know when we're going to have our workshops and events.
All right, yeah, thanks, Michelle.
Have a good day.